Little MAGA girl cried as a woke teacher tore up her patriotic artwork until a veteran appeared and subscribe to the channel right now to find out the end of this epic story and comment below which part of this great America you are watching from. Liberty High School was an architectural irony. Its name, etched into the weathered stone above the main entrance, promised freedom of thought and expression. Its interior, however, had become a labyrinth of conformity. At the heart of this paradox was Social Studies Room B12, a stage where a silent culture war was waged daily. The silence hanging over the room that Tuesday morning was the harbinger of an ideological storm, a forced silence where young minds learned, through repetition and fear, that the only way to survive was through acquiescence. At the center of this tension was Gigi. Just 14 years old, Gigi was the embodiment of the American innocence that Ms. Vortex, the leftist teacher, yearned to deconstruct. The pink bow in her blonde hair, her cotton sweater, everything about her evoked an ideal of traditional femininity and decency deemed toxic in the school's woke circles. Gigi wasn't an activist. She was, as her classmates affectionately dubbed her, a little MAGA girl. Not because she shouted political slogans, but because of a sincere, unwavering love for her country. A sentiment inherited from her grandparents who taught her to honor the flag and respect history. For Gigi, politics boiled down to honor and gratitude. It was with this purity that she had created her artwork. Resting on her desk was the drawing in question, President Donald Trump in a firm posture of salute, the phrase "America First" in proud capital letters, and beside him, a meticulously colored American flag, its stars and stripes perfect. This drawing was part of a free choice project on leadership and national symbols, but Gigi knew deep down that she had crossed an invisible line. Anxiety had been gnawing at her stomach from the moment the teacher walked in. Ms. Vortex wasn't just a teacher, she was the personification of ideological fury. With her hair dyed electric blue and hot pink, dressed in black from head to toe, and adorned with buttons displaying slogans against capitalism and patriotism, she was the visual and philosophical antithesis of Gigi. Her eyes, outlined in heavy makeup, scanned the room like interrogation spotlights. She taught history not as facts, but as a narrative of uninterrupted oppression, viewing every patriotic student as a vector of white supremacy and fascism. Ms. Vortex was the leftist determined to purge patriotism from the next generation. From the start of class, Gigi tried to conceal the drawing. She placed her notebook over it, hoping the teacher would walk right past. But Ms. Vortex had a keen sense for dissent. She walked slowly between the rows, pausing to deliver veiled reprimands to anyone wearing a shirt with the flag or showing any sign of pride not directed at her causes. Her approach toward Gigi was slow, glacial, every step of those combat boots echoing like the ticking of a bomb. Gigi felt her blood run cold. Her throat went dry, and her hands began to sweat. Finally, Ms. Vortex's shadow cast over the desk. The pungent scent of cheap perfume and hairspray hovered over the girl. The teacher stopped abruptly. The silence in room B12 became absolute, heavy enough to cut with a knife. The other students, who had already learned their lesson, lowered their heads, pretending to read their books, terrified that a casual glance at Gigi would turn them into accomplices. The terror in her classmates' eyes was a learned behavior. Miss Vortex looked at the drawing beneath Gigi's notebook. She didn't need to ask, but she did, not out of curiosity, but to initiate the public humiliation. "What is this, Gigi?" the teacher's voice hissed, amplified by a contained rage, loud enough for the question to echo like an accusation in a courtroom. Gigi tried to answer, her voice a choked whisper. It's my project on leadership, Miss Vortex, the president." Before she could finish the sentence, before she could even breathe, the teacher acted. In a sudden, violent motion, Ms. Vortex yanked the sheet from the desk. Gigi's notebook fell to the floor with a dry thud, but no one moved. The drawing hung suspended in the air, an ideological trophy in the hands of the antagonist. Gigi shrank back, retreating into her chair. A blush rose to her face, a wave of shameful heat. The fear was palpable. The little MAGA girl, in her vulnerability, felt the crushing weight of isolation and injustice. Tears came instantly, uncontrollable, hot and painful, streaming down her rosy cheeks. It was the pain of innocence, confronted by the tyranny of ideological fury. The exposition was complete. The oppressive environment had taken its toll. Gigi was utterly helpless, surrendered to the judgment and cruelty of her inquisitor. The leftist held the power. The act of destruction was about to begin. The inciting incident was inevitable. Ms. Vortex held up Gigi's drawing, pinching it with her fingertips as if handling biohazard waste, or worse, irrefutable proof of a conspiracy against her worldview. Gigi's bloodshot eyes followed the paper, every colored pencil line, every detail of the patriotic drawing she had made with such care. She clung to the hope that perhaps the teacher would simply reprimand her and give it back. But that small flame of optimism was extinguished by the leftist's wild, triumphant glare. The classroom had transformed completely into a stage for ideological hatred, and Gigi was the chosen sacrifice. The teacher wasn't speaking to the girl, but to the symbol the girl represented. "Look closely, class," began Ms. Vortex, her voice rising from a hiss to a hysterical shout that seemed rehearsed for maximum dramatic resonance. She gestured with her free hand, her chunky silver rings reflecting the cold ceiling light. This is hate speech masquerading as art." She emphasized the last word, spitting it out as if it were blasphemy. Her fury wasn't personal, but the embodiment of ideological rage that saw patriotism and conservative values as the root of all social evil. "You dare bring the image of this fascist into my sanctuary of learning? You think America first is an acceptable motto when we live in a system of global systemic oppression which seeks only profit, structural racism, and misogyny?" Her voice echoed, full of indignant vibrato, demanding the silent complicity of the frightened students. No one dared to cough. Gigi tried to argue, not against the ideology, but for her own decency. "No, Ms. Vortex, I just love my country and my grandparents told me he did a lot." The words, however, caught in her throat, fragile and insufficient against the wall of radical fury crushing her. The teacher was now completely consumed by the rhetoric of cancellation and narrative domination. She didn't see a crying child. She saw a manifestation of conservative privilege that needed to be crushed so the progressive future could flourish. "Love your country?" Ms. Vortex let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "What is there to love in an empire built on slavery, colonialism, and unchecked exploitation? You, Gigi, with your pink ribbons and your drawings of dictators, are living proof that patriarchal indoctrination still infects our schools. You people, with your little red hats and antiquated ideas, are the problem with this world." She stepped closer to Gigi's desk, invading her personal space, making the girl shrink away even further. The teacher gestured frantically, eyes wide, the contrast of her dyed hair and pale skin accentuating the intensity of her anger. "We are trying to build a progressive future, free from the shackles of the patriarchy and toxic nationalism, a world where social justice is the only flag, and you sabotage us with this reactionary garbage." The rising action reached its saturation point, and the inciting incident materialized. With a theatrical gesture calculated to inflict maximum pain and humiliation before the captive audience, Ms. Vortex gripped the drawing with both hands. She looked directly into Gigi's tear-filled eyes, not with anger, but with an ideological coldness that was far worse. That look said, "Your pride and your values have no place in my domain." And then she ripped the paper in half, slowly and deliberately. The sound of the paper being destroyed was horrifying, echoing in the silent room like a gunshot to the heart of Gigi's innocence. A sound of despair and censorship, but the act of the leftist didn't stop there. She ripped it again and again, turning the image of the President and the America First motto into unrecognizable strips. The pieces fell onto Gigi's desk, mixing with the American flag she had drawn separately, looking like the dead leaves of a destroyed dream. The cruelty was absolute. "Your patriotism is a disease, Gigi," she hissed the final sentence, leaning over the girl with a tone of perverse indoctrination. "Ah, and I'm going to cure you, whether you like it or not." Gigi's spirit was crushed. She broke down. The little MAGA girl covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. It wasn't just the pain of having her art destroyed, but the pain of being isolated, marginalized, and attacked for upholding the values her ancestors loved. She felt alone, small, completely defeated by the tyrannical authority using education as a weapon. She was the isolated victim, and the leftist had triumphed, imposing fear through verbal tyranny and the destruction of her freedom of speech. But as Gigi's sobs filled the air, and Ms. Vortex prepared to launch her next ideological diatribe, fate intervened. Ideological tyranny was about to collide with moral authority. Ms. Vortex, stepping back from the drama she had orchestrated herself, didn't notice the presence forming in the doorway. It was the exact moment when aggression and humiliation peaked, the instant of greatest despair for Gigi, that the hand of Providence, or perhaps the memory of American heroes, chose to intervene. The dramatic climax was just a step away. Ms. Vortex, exhausted by the ideological fury that had consumed her energy, took a step back, satisfied with the effect of her performance. Gigi was collapsed in tears, the class was in petrified silence, and the symbol of patriotism had been reduced to humiliating scraps. She was about to grab the remainder of the American flag drawn on the table to complete the final act of censorship and degradation, cementing her victory over traditional values in the minds of the youth. The leftist prepared to close the cycle of oppression. In this exact and crucial instant, classroom B12 was invaded by a presence that was the antithesis of everything Ms. Vortex represented. The door opened not with a request for permission or a casual bang, but with the unwavering firmness of someone who had an undeniable right to be there. The muffled sound of a solid wooden cane striking the linoleum floor cut through Gigi's sobs, and the oppressive silence. All eyes, including the astonished Ms. Vortex's, turned to the entrance. There, standing on the threshold, was Sergeant Major Thomas, a genuine and imposing Way-2 veteran. His figure was living history. He wore a khaki military uniform, classic and impeccable, with the dignity that only decades of service and honor could bestow. His chest wasn't adorned with buttons of empty slogans, but with rows of ribbon bars, the Bronze Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and countless others that narrated campaigns of bravery and sacrifice in Europe. Each medal gleamed in the morning light, a silent testament to the true cost of freedom. Though stooped by age and walking with a slight limp, his spine and his gaze, fixed on the scene of destruction and the crying girl, were of absolute moral authority. He was the sudden, dramatic, and decisive intervention, maximizing the climax. The teacher, caught at the height of her tyrannical act, tried to react, but her voice lost all its virulence. Who are you? You can't come in here. We are in the middle of a crucial lesson on social deconstruction and you do not have permission to interrupt." Ms. Vortex's voice, previously strident, now sounded thin and desperate. The veteran ignored her for a moment. He advanced slowly, his cane measuring the ground with military precision. His eyes, which had seen the misery of war and the face of totalitarian evil, fixed first on Gigi and the torn remnants on the desk. His presence filled the room, forcing the teacher to instinctively back away. Upon reaching Gigi, Sergeant Thomas stopped and, with an unexpected tenderness that contrasted with his austere appearance, placed a wrinkled, strong hand on the girl's trembling shoulder. "Don't cry, daughter," he said with a raspy, deep and steady voice that carried the weight of history. "Tears are for those with no hope, and as long as I am standing, you have hope. No one here has the right to steal your honor or your love for your country." Then he turned, and his clear blue eyes met Miss Vortex's wide eyes. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The contrast between genuine sacrifice, the uniform and medals, and empty rhetoric, the dyed hair and buttons, was overwhelming. "Deconstruction?" asked Sergeant Major Thomas, the word coming out with contained scorn as he pointed to the fragments of the Trump drawing and the patriotic slogan. "You call tearing up a child's work and publicly humiliating her for loving her homeland education. I called that tyranny, totalitarianism, when I fought against it in Europe in 1944. You are repeating the methods of repression that my blood helped to bury." Ms. Vortex tried to counterattack with her usual catchphrases, desperate to restore her ideological authority. "You don't understand. You represent the old world, imperialism, militaristic patriarchy. This girl needs to be educated, not to idolize symbols of hate." The veteran let out a short, cold laugh, devoid of any humor. He took another step, and his imposing stature, even with age, dominated Ms. Vortex. "Hate? Ma'am, I have seen hate. I have seen what happens when freedom of speech is banned, when books and art are burned, when children are indoctrinated to hate their own history and their heroes. What you are doing, using your position of power to terrorize a student for her convictions, is exactly what I fought to destroy. It is the enemy of freedom." He leaned in slightly, and the shine of his medals caught the teacher's face. "I bled on foreign soil so that this girl, and even you, would have the right to speak, to draw, to think, but you do not have the right to bully an American child. The freedom you use to dye your hair and preach your latte-sipping socialism was paid for with the lives of my friends, and I will not allow you to use it to silence this young patriot." The confrontation was immediate, and the leftist was morally defeated by the veteran's undeniable authority and honor. Ms. Vortex stumbled backward, the color draining from her face. She realized she had lost the narrative, not just to the veteran, but to the audience in the classroom. The students, watching in silence, began exchanging looks of admiration and relief. She stammered incoherent excuses, unable to articulate any argument that could overcome Sergeant Thomas's morality. With a final look of spiteful hatred, she launched her final threat, the only weapon left to her ideology: the use of the system. You and this girl will be reported. This is harassment and incitement. You will be cancelled, and I will ensure the school administration knows that your fascist speech will not be tolerated." She retreated, casting a venomous look at Gigi before hurriedly exiting through the back door of the classroom. Unable to bear the humiliation of her moral defeat, the veteran, impassive, waited for the door to slam. The climax had passed. He turned to Gigi, who raised her head, tears still flowing, but a glimmer of relief and gratitude in her eyes. Institutional tension hung in the air. The leftist had promised cancellation, but justice had triumphed, and Sergeant Thomas was there to ensure the little MAGA girl no longer felt alone. He picked up the American flag that remained intact on the desk, the only symbol she hadn't managed to destroy, and held it with reverence. The denouement was ready to restore honor. The falling action was immediate and overwhelming, not with the silence of fear, but with the reverent stillness that follows a great moral battle. The echo of the door closing behind Miss Vortex in her humiliated flight signaled the beginning of the resolution. Sergeant Major Thomas, the WT veteran whose presence had restored order and decency, maintained his firm posture. His eyes softened as he turned fully to Gigi, who now looked at him with a mixture of awe and relief. She no longer covered her face. The veteran took the American flag Gigi had drawn, the only sheet the teacher failed to tear, and held it in his weathered hands. He unfolded it carefully, treating the paper with the respect one would reserve for a sacred artifact. He knelt with difficulty beside the desk, bringing his face close to Gigi's. The Medal of Honor on his lapel gleamed. "You see this, little one?" he whispered, pointing to the flag. "This isn't just an old cloth. It's a symbol. It is the blood of millions who, like me, defended the right for you to draw what you love. For you to be proud of your nation, even if tyrants try to tell you otherwise." He placed the flag in Gigi's hands, and she clutched it to her chest. The girl began to sob again, but this time they weren't tears of fear, but of gratitude and profound emotion. It was the catharsis of having her honor restored. Sergeant Thomas then took a small pin from his lapel, a tiny golden American flag, a pin he obviously cherished, and placed it on the girl's desk next to the strips of torn paper. "Never let anyone say it's wrong to love your country, little one," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "Never bow your head to those who hate freedom. Your patriotism is the vaccine against the disease we just witnessed." The other students, sensing that the oppression had been lifted, began to move. A boy in the back of the room started clapping timidly. The sound grew, spreading quickly. Soon, all 30 students who had been held hostage by fear of Miss Vortex were applauding the veteran and, through him, Gigi's silent courage. The applause wasn't for politics. It was for the victory of decency over cruelty. Sergeant Thomas stood up slowly. He knew Ms. Vortex's threat of cancellation was real within the school system, but his moral authority was superior to any ideological bureaucracy. "I am Sergeant Major Thomas," he declared to the whole class, his voice strong. "I was invited to speak about history, but it seems I gave a lesson in living history. Freedom always has defenders. Oppression, whether in a uniform or in woke rhetoric, will always be defeated. What Ms. Vortex did was a violation of trust and freedom of speech. I assure you, Gigi, and everyone here, that justice will prevail over this ideological tyranny. I will speak with the school administration, and I guarantee this aggression will not go unpunished. My country taught me to fight for what is right, and I will do that for you." The narrative closed with the final triumph and the promise of the MAGA girl's growth. Gigi, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, smiled through the crying. She looked at the golden pin and the flag in her lap. That day, although painful, had not diminished her. It had strengthened her. The humiliation transformed her into a symbol of resistance. She realized she was not alone, and that the flame of traditional values and American freedom still burned brightly, protected by the heroes of a braver generation. Classroom B12 would end the morning not with the dark indoctrination of the radical left, but with a powerful and moving lesson on the true meaning of honor, sacrifice, and civil courage. Good had triumphed, embodied in the dignity of the veteran and the resilience of the little MAGA girl. Gigi looked up, holding the flag firmly. She knew the fight would continue outside that room, but now she had her badge of honor and the certainty that there were moral giants ready to defend America and her children. The flag in her hands and the veteran's pin on the table never looked so bright. Symbols of the victory of the nation's unwavering values over the shadow of ideological tyranny.